Now that we've discussed at great length the current situation in Mexico, we need to take a longer view. We need to investigate the rise of the export, import, industrialization, and trade of certain substances. So we'll focus on the early modern context, which laid the foundation for a commodities revolution that began in the 17th century. Our main point is that the same factors that gave rise to the modern world, things like global trade, industrialization, and scientific development, were the same factors that produced the psychoactive revolution. That is, the diffusion, trade, and use of first plant based and then synthetic substances that altered consciousness. Between 1839 and 1842, and again in 1856 to 1858, a fairly small British Imperial Navy detachment invaded, bombarded, and destroyed ports all along the Chinese coast. They destroyed every Chinese ship that came out in defense of the Qing imperial government. The British did so for that most quintessential of all British vices, a cup of tea, or perhaps we should call it millions of cups of tea. By 1790, the British East India Company was basically running most of South Asia, fueled by the trade in tea. 23 million pounds of Chinese tea were being shipped to London a year. The problem was that China, at the time, didn't really want anything that the British had to offer in terms of manufactured goods, except for silver, which they could get from other sources. British trading companies got excited, however, when they realized that the Chinese people wanted something that the British could provide: opium. The best opium grew in India at that time, which the British controlled as a colony, and the East India Company had a monopoly on. At the time, the Chinese allowed foreigners to trade at one port, and one port only, Guangzhou. Thus, the British merchants sold Indian opium to Chinese for silver and then purchased Chinese tea with the silver. They then sold the tea for higher profits back in England. British and Indians used opium in their tea sometimes, but for the Chinese, who began to smoke the derivative from poppy plants, the effects were much stronger and habit-forming. By 1839, so many Chinese were smoking opium, probably around 15 million, that the Chinese emperor declared one of the world's first drug wars in modern history. He outlawed this stuff. The British were not content with that arrangement, however. The Chinese drug enforcement czar, at the time, a man by the name of Lin Zexu, and the British trade leader in Guangzhou faced off. That British trade leader was named Charles Eliot, and he persuaded the opium smugglers to surrender 1,700 tons of the stuff to the Chinese, saying that the British government would pay them for their losses. This enabled the tea to continue to be traded. However, things went south when the British Prime Minister said no way. They were put on the spot by the British opium dealers. The London business lobby wouldn't stand for it and pressured the Prime Minister to send a fleet to China to demand repayment. The so-called Opium Wars resulted in several treaties, known in Chinese as the unequal treaties because they limited Chinese sovereignty. All this to fuel trade in opium and tea, two plant-based substances that grew increasingly popular in the 17th century. Still more in the 18th century, and then almost seemed like indispensable cultural commodities by the 19th. What can account for this? Well, to begin answering this question, we need to look at the early modern context. This class will not only focus exclusively on the British-Chinese opium and tea trade, but rather the bigger question will be what factors gave rise to the trade and use of psychoactive agents. In a phrase, we start with the material conditions, the so-called Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between regions of the world did not begin with Columbus. However, the importance of the Columbian encounter would up the ante. Now, both hemispheres that weren't in contact are now in contact. The relative isolation of these regions of the world brought forth staggering changes in population, and millions of indigenous peoples in the Americas had no immunities to European diseases such as smallpox. But also, on the other hand, plants such as tobacco, potatoes, corn, and many others that were not in Europe now entered the European diet. Tobacco, coffee, tea, sugar, and many other substances, some with consciousness changing effects, made their way to Europe. Many of these were added to diets, and some became increasingly used for medical purposes. Alcohol, opium, coffee, tea, cola nuts were all used to give pleasure, and the increasing availability of these substances facilitated by trade increased their use, especially by the wealthy. So their availability and then the increased efficiency in producing them, i.e., industrialization, made them cheaper. Many within European countries now had increasing incentives to trade in them for taxes or profits. This process of global exchange and marketability can be called the psychoactive revolution. Thanks. That's all I have for you today.